Oshavar was born upon the Tau Sept world of Vior-La, known for its aggressive and bombastic fire warriors, and his meteoric rise through the ranks of the Firecaste began in the training domes of Montir. Enrolled in the planet's junior academies as soon as he could walk, like all members of the Firecaste, he quickly established himself as a serious and dedicated aspirant with a voracious appetite for information. His peers were gifted too, but the young Shavar had a spark of brilliance that stood out from every other Tau of his generation. Within solar days, it became obvious to his tutors that they had more than a simple fire warrior on their hands. Even in his youth, Shavar was fiercely independent. Within his first Tau-seer of basic tutelage and several fact-finding raids into the enrollment centers of the Montir training academies later, Shavar was accepted for training a full 3 Terran years before standard enrollment was due. The young Violan's martial temperament was the subject of much discussion amongst the academy masters. His physical skills were well above average for his age, and he proved truly remarkable with his ability to retain tremendous amounts of data from each situation that he encountered. His ability to use the knowledge he gained from every experience to assess and predict the actions of those around him was unnerving, and earned him the nickname Sho, which means inner light in the Tau tongue. Despite being several standard years younger than most of the other Tau in the Battle Dome, Sho's eidetic memory and fierce determination earned him a string of perfect scores in the Academy's simulations. His team's casualty count was so low as to be unprecedented, and Sho escaped being tagged by hostile sim ghosts every time he entered a combat exercise, even in the infamous Jungle of 1,000 Eyes. At the time Sho's graduation to the Firecaste was announced, the legendary commander Puretide was still making a point of personally initiating as many new recruits into the ranks as possible. The famous commander was on military business on Vior-La when Sho's generation of warriors were inducted, and to the great pleasure of Montir's warriors, he agreed to be present for the ceremony. Amidst much bowing and scraping, the Montir Academy's tutors told Puretide of the student they called Sho, the first warrior to have been enrolled into the academy at such a young age. As Commander Puretide bestowed the rank of Shazlar upon the Chow prodigy, he asked Sho how he could consistently second-guess even the most devious of traps and scenarios set by his tutors. The young Tau politely explained that he usually thought of what plans he would set in place if he were a tutor trying to test a team of students, and then worked to disable those plans as best he could. Meaningful glances were exchanged between the assembled dignitaries, but nothing more was said on the matter at the time. 2 Rotar later, Sho and his fellow novitiates were sent to their first war zone against the Arachan insurgents of the Western Vale, whilst behind closed doors, Commander Puretide and his aides discussed the fact that Sho's military acumen and prowess were as promising as they hoped. As was standard procedure, the young Tau served for the first 4 Terran years of his career as a member of a fire warrior team in a hunter cadre. Although he was posted to the fiercest war zones of each engagement, the young Tau proved more than capable during the Firecaste's ongoing purges of the Arachan species. En route to the war zone, Sho memorized every fact the Watercaste had been able to glean in their dealings with the female ostromystics of that many-legged species, and had thoroughly analyzed the battle doctrine of the Arachan's blade-legged male gender. During the 4 standard years of war he spent as a Shazlar trooper, Sho became known to every warrior in his cadre. His ability to wield a pulse rifle at extreme close range saw him drive back several Arakan surprise attacks, and he was always quick to push home any advantage that he could gain. He quickly earned the trust of his senior officer, Shasui Mon Oka, and later his respect. This turned to eternal gratitude at the Battle of the Great Web, where Sho shot the Shasui free of a tangle clutch trap, saving him from the egg sacs of the Ostromystics and the horrific death that would otherwise have followed. By the end of his tenure as a fire warrior, it was Sho's suggestions that formed the vast majority of his unit's battle plans. Firm believer in the greater good, Shasui Monoka recommended his charges for their first trial by fire at the earliest opportunity. With the approval of their superior cadre Fireblade, the young Tau warrior and his team were shipped back to Viola for potential promotion. The trial by fire was a traumatic experience. A high level of adversity is the norm for the warrior caste's coming-of-age tests, but there were those at the training academy that remembered Sho's inadvertent hand in the fall of their old colleagues, and wished to test him all the more harshly for it. Sho was thrust into a pitch-black, live-fire war dome, where he and his team were assailed by numerous nameless horrors that defied classification or understanding. Even Sho's quick wits were of limited use, and in the end it was the fire in his soul that secured his fate. When a tentacled Moor thing came whirring down to chew the Shasui apart, Sho threw himself headlong into his path, and was cut to ribbons in the process. The Tau warrior died that day, and not for the last time. When Sho was brought back from his simular coma, his tutors informed him that only those of his team who had died in the ordeal had passed their trials, and that his new rank was that of Shasui. When Sho asked after those who did not pass their trial, however, his question was met only with stony silence. Though a hidden part of Sho's soul railed at this, his gladness at being alive and the fulfillment of his most fervent desire temporarily drowned out any more questions that he had, for with the rank of Shasui came the honor that Sho had always dreamed of, the right to pilot a Tau battlesuit. After returning to the Western Vale to garner experience as a fire warrior Shasui, Sho was quickly inducted into the armored elite of the Tau armies. However, whilst analysing drone-captured footage of his time as a fire warrior, Sho's Violan masters had noted a marked affinity for close action in the young Tau's tactics. The Firecast Tau commanders, who had monitored his progress, wanted to teach Sho the self-control and perspective of a support role. On the day the young prodigy reported for duty to Shas-Ar Tol High Command, he was immediately assigned to the specialist pilots of the XV-88 broadside battlesuit teams. It was under the auspices of the veteran rifleman Shazvir Obolota that Sho learnt the basics of battlesuit command, and in the process a measure of restraint. At first, Sho was privately crestfallen at his reassignment to the back ranks of the Arakan War, yet he knew that the war effort was greater than his own personal desires. He applied every part of his exceptional mind to mastering the systems of his XV-88 broadside, drinking in specification data and after-action reports with every waking hour that he spent outside the suit's piloting matrix. Within a single training cycle, Sho was getting more range and accuracy out of his battlesuit's heavy rail rifle than Shazvir Obolatai himself. As soon as the correct training programs had been observed, Obolotai's support cadre was dispatched to the Vale with all haste. There, his team blew apart one huge-bellied ostrom-mystic after another, and Sho earned himself a new epithet, the Young Executioner. Though only his mentor Oblotai picked up on it, the 4 Terran years fighting at the rear of the hunter cadre's efforts were the most trying times of Sho's life so far. To be armed and armoured in the height of Tau offensive technology, and yet to have to rely on younger, more lightly armoured warriors to fight in his stead, it was a kind of torture that Sho never wanted to repeat. 4 Terran years, and one vertiginous trial by fire later, Sho earned his wish, because he had served long enough, and with enough distinction to earn the rank of Shazvre. He was entrusted to the command of a cutting-edge XV-8 crisis battlesuit. He was expected to master its weapon systems quickly, for Commander Dawnstone himself was about to lead the warriors of Vior-La in the final actions of the Veil War, and she needed the best troops the planet could provide at her side. A period of exceptionally bloody battle soon unfolded across the Western Vale, scarring Sho both physically and mentally. He lost most of his left leg to a skittling swarm that got inside a damaged part of his crisis armor, and saw many trusted comrades meet spectacularly visceral ends, their battlesuits physically ripped apart by great Arakan grandfathers. However, Sho's agility and skill at the helm of the XV-8 battlesuit quickly became famous amongst Dawnstone's command. He was promoted to Saz Nami, taking his place alongside one of his former tutors as a close protection officer for his commander. Sho repaid the faith placed in him tenfold during the engagement, with the much-feared Arakan Trinity at the heart of the war effort. Having unwound the maze-like logic patterns with which the Arakan made their nests, Sho led his commander to the silken heart of the Arakan cocoon ship. There he and the commander Dawnstone launched the Monkar strike that killed all 3 of the Trinity and expelled the Arakan from the Western Vale once and for all. En route back to Vior-La, tragedy struck. Whilst docked with the cocoon ship, Master Dawnstone's flagship had been infested with the Arakan skittlings that poured out of the vents and conduits to swarm through its blue-lit corridors. Perhaps intended as a last spiteful gesture of defiance, the infestation fell upon the Fire Warrior Command Council while they were engaged in debate, catching them unarmed and dressed only in their fatigues. Sho held the swarm back, using his body to block the doorway to the chamber as best he could, whilst his commander and their aides made their escape. Sho stood firm, but the venom tusks of the skittlings piercing his skin again and again proved too much, and his tortured frame shook its last. Sho awoke in a medbay with the familiar sounds of Battle Dome Montier visible outside. Dawnstone herself was sitting by his bedside to inform him that the skittling attack had in fact been a trial by fire. The whole event was a simulation. Just as she had hoped, Sho had excelled in his role as a bodyguard, even without his battlesuit to rely on. In light of his success, he had been promoted to Chasse Ale, a commander in training. Better yet, Sho had succeeded in his duties with such flying colours that the venerable Commander Puretide himself had agreed to train him in the arts of war. Sho was transported to Dalaith Prime, where he made his way to the peak of Mount Kanji, seat of Puretide's tutelage. With only his wits and tenacity to call upon, the journey up the sheer mountainside was a grueling test by itself. Yet, by using a system of improvised pulleys and the dead weight of a Kanjan snow lynx that he had killed with a makeshift slingshot, Sho made the journey up the perilous face of the mountain, kilometre by painstaking kilometre. Soon after he reached the topmost peak, Sho found Commander Puretide deep in meditation. Seated in focused meditation in front of Puretide were two young Tau warriors, one who later introduced himself as Chassera, a fellow aspirant to the command ranks of the Fire Caste, and the other a taciturn but gifted young warrior known as Case. Through the hardships that were to follow, the three aspirants became as close as Ta Lysera bondmates, albeit ones engaged in a bitter rivalry for the approval of their elderly master. Each of Puretide's students had a different style of war, and a separate philosophy to go with it. Sho's simmering passion and desire to plunge into the fires of battle saw him gravitate towards the Montcar, or killing blow strategies, while Chassera was a careful and meticulous practitioner of the patient hunter, Koyon. Case, a withdrawn and strange individual, was unusual in that he sought mastery of the Monat's way of war. His goal was to become the perfect lone warrior, an army of one that could triumph in any situation with only the materials to hand. Though Sho regularly scored the highest in the training simulations, his peers were not far behind. The competition between them each saw them drive for success just as hard as in any true war zone, and in the process earn the respect of their fellow students. Commander Puretide had long ago mastered every one of Tau's martial disciplines, and more besides. Over the years he honed his students' abilities to near superhuman levels, all the while striving to make them appreciate the alternative strategies available to the wise. When each was asked to fight in the manner of one of their peers, they did well enough, and in truth they were only going through the motions, purely to ensure their master's approval rather than truly engaging with each other's strategies. Each student had followed his or her own path, and was loath to stray far from it. One by one, the Tau warriors left Puretide's side, their studies as complete as time would ever afford. They took their new names and titles from the peak of Mount Kanji: Shasso Sho, Shasso Chassera, and Monat Shasso Case. Though they would go on to fight in different war zones across the Tau Empire, the three disciples of Puretide were all to make their mark on history. The planet of Arkunasha was settled during the Second Sphere expansion. Despite the aridity of the oxide deserts that made up the world's surface, the Tau had settled the Red Planet with a sizable population. This they had achieved through the tireless work of the Earth-caste scientists and engineers. By their efforts, the Tau Empire had girded the planet with two necklace-like rings of biodomes that ran around the most temperate latitudes, each a mirror distance from the equator. From orbit, the world appeared as a blood-red globe adrift in the ocean of space, banded with two rows of bioluminescent lights that pulsed bluish-white, like the flanks of some deep-sea organism. In their preliminary investigations during the earliest expeditions to Arkunasha's surface, the Earth-caste had made a disturbing discovery. Whilst determining the source of the oxide deserts that covered the world, they found a great variance in the metallic composition and even origin of the various particulates. It was as if the world had been entirely covered in metal structures at some time in the distant past, which had long since been utterly ground to dust. Given the depth of the oxide residue, that ancient civilization must have included several artificial cities the size of mountain ranges. Theories abounded throughout the Earthcast about the planet-wide catastrophe that had torn everything upon the planet's surface apart. Though the Tau had no idea what might have caused the Arkunasha's spectacular death, or who the inhabitants might have been, they had taken their first glimpse of the world-destroying power of the Imperium of mankind. The orc crusade of violence known as War appeared in the vicinity of Arkunasha without warning or reason. One equinox a strange solar storm erupted that appeared to make odd symbols in the sky. When it had subsided, the Earthcast sighted something that defied all logic. The eastern void was now dotted with hundreds of energy signatures, every one of them heading on a collision course with Arkunasha. Weeks later, the planet was in throes of a full-scale war. An orc invasion of vast size had descended, slamming giant asteroid fortresses into the planet's dunes. The crudeness of the orc assault had been its saving grace. The Earthcast's firing solutions would depressurize or destroy a conventional fleet before it reached orbit, but there was nothing conventional about the greenskin armada. Even the heavy rail cannons that bristled from the Tau biodomes had proven next to useless against the porous balls of rock and junk hurtling in their direction. More and more orc craft hurtled out of the sky and crunched into the dunes at a jaw-dropping planetfall the Tau took to calling the Goroka, or Death Hail. Hunter and Defender cadre were scrambled to each crash site, but greenskins seethed out of the impact crater around each fallen asteroid, like water overflowing a boiling cauldron. By the time Commander Sho and his fleet reached Arkunasha's orbit, the planet had been all but overrun. With the exception of a few highly mobile strike forces abroad in the desert, the Tau military presence planetside had been destroyed in a series of disastrously one-sided engagements. The rest of the populace was holed up in transparent biodomes that ringed the planet, although the orcs had destroyed most of the connecting structures in short order. They had not worked out a way to pierce the meters-thick carapaces of the inhabitants themselves. Each was an island in a sea of invaders, surrounded by barbaric hordes that hammered and hollered on the thick transplastic separating them from their prey. The Tau inside got a good chance to study their persecutors up and close, but the habitat's resources were dwindling, and their military forces were pitifully inadequate for the task of repelling the orcs. Without each biodome's surrounding dew farms bringing in the regular water they relied upon, the life expectancy of Arkunasha's people could be measured in weeks at least, under their siege inside their domes. After this counter-invasion fleet made it to Arkunasha's surface, entirely unmolested, Commander Sho was extensively briefed on the situation by the Tau trapped in Arkunasha's biodomes. The planet's dust storms proved to be able to be avoided with careful monitoring of the Earthcast's suborbital drone network, but according to the Aircast's aerial observations, there appeared to be even more of the violent alien warbands roaming the desert than in the first few weeks of the invasion. Stranger still, drone scans had confirmed something that the ethereals had originally put down to fearful rumor-mongering. The individual orcs testing the defences of each biodome were slowly getting bigger. Thus far, the bestial aliens had resisted or ignored all attempts to communicate or broker terms, and the watercasts were at a loss how to proceed. All the green-skinned beast seemed to want to do was fight. In his pre-battle meditations on the subject, Osho found that he could relate to that concept. In his heart he relished the thought of once more risking his life in the name of the greater good. The spectacle of war called to him, the noise, the light, even the letting of blood. These reflections were his first step towards understanding the psyche of the orc, and in achieving that understanding, turning the tide of the Arkunasha war. Though the Tau had engaged whole alien civilizations before and engaged triumphant in almost all those invasions, the Firecast had held the upper hand. This was one of the few times the Tau war machine would be tested in such desperately unfavourable conditions. Training simulations always included modules where the Tau were outnumbered by their enemies, sometimes in as many as 10 times over. Here the foe teemed across the dunes in their billions. Orbital snapshots gained on entry into the atmosphere indicated that the orcs outnumbered the Firecast counter-invasion by nearly 400 to 1. When the Aircast's final observations were relayed to the commander during his descent, he nodded in solemn acknowledgement. His contingent's cadres would have to use the weapons of the mind rather than the gauntlet, he said. Against the savage beast, such a strategy was inevitable. When asked to clarify his intent, Osho drew one of the ornamental swords from the wall above and stabbed it through the arm of the command throne before snapping its blade in half. It was a metaphor that was to become famous amongst the Firecast in the ensuing months. The initial engagements against the orcs were intended to re-establish supply routes and test the greenskins' defences and capabilities in the meantime, using hunter cadres skimming the surface of the world in devilfish transports and flight-capable battlesuits. He experimented with the enemy by killing enough orcs from long range to ensure their scattered mobs were on the brink of panic. Almost without exception, it was the largest orc in each group that restored order. The simplicity of their military structure was such that it had been overlooked. In the orc psyche, might made right and nothing more. Another observation Osho made was that whenever his troops struck the milling orc armies and faded away, almost immediately fighting would erupt, even if no foe was left to engage. The orcs could take any excuse to attack each other. Leadership challenges, theft of property, even careless remarks would flare up into brawls. Recordings of this were taken and sent back to the mobile headquarters Osho had established, a disc-shaped command center that constantly prowled the dunes in a cushion of anti-gravitic energy. Next came a year-long period known as the Great Thinning. Farsight ordered forward stealth contingents and battlesuit teams to patrol the dunes, locating and destroying the largest orcs in each mob with pinpoint fire before disappearing without a trace. This inevitably sent the rest of the orcs into a frenzy of violence as they cast around for perpetrators before turning on each other. Blood would fly after each kill as the orcs fought over who would take command next, and the body count climbed steadily higher. As more and more monitor drones reported back to high command, Osho watched every recording with cold fascination. Before long, he had deciphered not only the crude system of glyphs the orcs used as a writing tool, but also the guttural orc tongue. Soon he was telling his aides what would happen next in each recorded event before it unfolded. His officers joked that he must have seen the recordings already, but they knew full well that their commander had simply come to understand his barbaric foe very well. His command staff were soon referring to him by their new moniker, Shavar, or far-sighted. The knowledge gleaned from these intercepted messages slowly filtered into the Firecast's military doctrine. Wherever the orc glyphs for boss, mech, or dock appeared on the orc vehicle, the hunter cadres would prioritize that vehicle's destruction, and concentrated hammerhead fire and XV-88 broadside battlesuit support would rain down on the disgusting vehicles, exploding them and slowing the orc response times to a crawl. Though the Tau could not form the syllables of orc speech, Osho's Earthcast allies cut audio snippets of orcish challenges and insults into the comms networks invaders had looted from Fallen Tau, delivering the right orcish insults at the right time. Osho drove a wedge of dissent between every clan and tribe roaming the desert, sparking a series of minor wars in the process. Within a year, the greenskin beast that had invaded Arkunasha was chewing on its own tail. Osho's tactics had distracted the orcs to such an extent that Tau forces were able to get food and water to the people trapped in the biodomes and free the remains of the Arkunashan firecast, further bolstering their ranks. Though many of the Tau Central Command quietly congratulated each other on a well-prosecuted war, most of the orc invaders yet lived. Throughout both the populace of Arkunasha and the counter-invasion force, the Tau now universally knew their leader was Oshoa, or Commander Farsight. Despite his honor, he was not satisfied with their progress, and knew the fight was far from over. The more organized of the tribes had begun systemically looting the comms networks, guns and armor of Fallen Tau that lay scattered amongst the rust dunes. Wherever a burning hulk that had once been a Tau skimmer hung suspended above the desert of still-functioning repulsors, the orcs would extinguish the flames with buckets of rust particulate and repurpose it, fitting it with smoke-spewing engines and solid shot weapons. The monitor drone recordings showed that the orc caste known as mechs were having their slave races dig deep into the oxide dunes to unearth scrap metal. The Tau would never stoop to use this raw material, but the orcs found it useful in the extreme. As more and more orc vehicles came armored in or even wholly constructed from oxidized metal, the hordes blended with the desert itself in a form of accidental camouflage. Worse still, surprise attacks from orc hordes were becoming more and more frequent. The aircast soon covered why. The veteran orcs that had been fighting upon Arkunasha since the first invasion had grown skin that was thick and gnarled enough to protect them from abrasive effects of the rust storms. Each time these bands allowed a storm to overtake them, a handful of greenskins were snatched up and killed by the red tornadoes, but the rest marched in relative safety in the eye of the storm, protected from the hunter cadre that roamed the desert. When the storm broke upon a Tau base, these wandering packs of elite orcs would appear from swirling clouds with a vicious anger worthy of an enraged Narlock. Commander Farsight had expected the orcs to be resourceful, but he had not come to fully appreciate the advantages afforded by their uncanny physiology. The number of orcs at Arkunasha was actually increasing rather than being slowly whittled down. Oshavar and his ethereal masters were forced to consider the matter of orc reproduction, a chain of thought no civilized species would like to follow. Farsight's most trusted Earthcast advisor, the young genius Ovessa, believed that the orcs had a fungal component to their genetic makeup. He maintained that the spores that they continuously shed were flourishing in the oxide deserts. If his theories were to be believed, every morning the rust dunes, covered with a film of dew, would shiver and collapse to reveal a clutch of immature dune orcs, low in tech level, but spoiling for a fight. When word got out that the orcs' numbers were actually increasing, it hit morale like a megaton bomb. The ethereals present in the expedition insisted that it was impossible to channel more resources to Arkunasha. The Tau stationed there would have to overcome this foe on their own. Farsight was forced to abandon his program of assassinations and turn his attention to his own camp. Morale was on the brink of crumbling, and with it, any chance that the Tau had of claiming back the planet. Since his arrival at Arkunasha, Farsight had led a number of strike teams to the front line, His XV8 Crisis battlesuit's plasma rifle had claimed more of the orcs' ruling caste than any other. The senior watercaste envoy that accompanied his expedition, poor O'Case, had a great play of Farsight's victories. Positive propaganda was circulated throughout every biodome and mobile base, but still Tau spirits were sinking. In deep talks with poor O'Case, Commander Farsight came to the conclusion that one of the orc race's primary weapons was its warlike spirit. The orcs spent little more than none of their energies on angst or paranoia, instead channeling everything they had into seeking and fighting battles. The greenskin armies would expend a great number of lives in pursuing the Tau wherever they were sighted, even if it meant sustaining over 90% casualties in the process. Yet that last 10% would run roughshod over a hunter cadre if they caught them. Critically, the close-quarters ability of the Firecast was no match for the strength and brutality of the orc hordes. As the war ground on and the progress graphs in Tau Central Command took an ever more downward trend, Farsight finished what was to be his definitive work on the greenskin mindset. The Book of the Beast, as Oshavar called it, was circulated to every cadre fireblade, battlesuit chassui, and Kroot shaper left on the planet. The tactical acumen in its pages was astounding. It taught the Firecast how to think like an orc, to understand their language, even to fight with the fury of an orc in battle if necessary. Above all, it taught them that their commander understood the enemy well, and that the Tau could still win. The next few years saw a transformation in the Tau approach to the war for Arkunasha. No longer did the Firecast dance out of reach, engaging the greenskin menace at close quarters only when absolutely necessary. Instead, the Tau military machine reversed its tactics, driving teams of fire warriors and battlesuits close to blast apart the orcs wherever Farsight's dune-stalking Pathfinder teams covered them. When the orcs mounted one of their fearsome charges, the Tau would hold their ground at the ambush point, kneeling in the rust and laying down a fearsome network of supporting fire that overlapped whenever the orcs came close. Should any greenskin make it through the deadly lattice, they would be charging into a storm of blazing light from the Firecast's time-delayed photon grenades. If necessary, the surviving greenskins would then be shot at point-blank range, or even clubbed to death with the barrels of pulse rifles while they reeled from the photon blasts, unable to defend themselves from the vengeful Tau. It was a dangerous tactic, perhaps needlessly so. Yet new life had been breathed into the Firecast fighting upon Arkunasha. Many of Oshavar's pupils took the new tactic with particular zeal, the combative Commander Brightsword most of all. Ambassador Poor O'Case ensured that footage of Brightsword and his cadre overcoming an orc charge at close quarters was seen far and wide. Up until that point, the Tau had done little more than defend their own biodomes. Now they were relishing the strategy of an all-out attack. Oshavar had put flame in the bellies of his warriors, and it was there to stay. All across the planet, battle broke out with a renewed fervour. In a maze-like canyon network of the Arkunashan equator, Oshavar lured columns of rust-plated orc vehicles into ever narrower channels until, with a simple vehicle kill at each end of the armoured column, the orcs were trapped in place and slaughtered like herd beasts in an abattoir. Scant miles away, nimble piranhas led orc dakajets and deathcopters on a merry dance through drone-mapped canyons until, one by one, the clumsy orc pilots collided. Farsight's Kroot mercenaries feasted on a daily diet of Dune-orc flesh, adapting to the environment until their skin was tough enough to withstand even a red storm. They roamed the sands with their Narlock pack beasts, stoically weathering the losses from rust tornadoes as they plunged into the tempests to ambush the orc knobs inside. The vicious greenskin scouts that ranged ahead of each tribe were spied upon and slain in their turn by optimized stealth teams, leaving the bulk of each orc army wandering directionless under the harsh desert sun until they turned upon each other in frustration. Everywhere the teachings of Farsight's Book of the Beast took their toll. As the hunter cadre mastered its methods, Oshavar led his armies against greenskin hordes that outnumbered them hundreds to one and emerged triumphant. Slowly but surely the progress graphs in Central Command began to change. During this unprecedented method of success for the Tau upon Arkunasha, the people of the biodomes were extracted and moved to the natural fortress of the highlands, away from the comforts of home but safe enough to survive whilst the war raged below. The hunter cadre continued to thin out and then eradicate the orc armies, milling across the dunes in a series of Montka strikes that were pitilessly efficient. Then came an invocation from the orc ranks that changed the face of the war once again. Though the war had by now been reduced to less than a quarter of its former size, the deserts were still infested. Dune orcs pushed their way out of the red sands with every dawn, and the docks at the head of the war had an almost necromantic talent for stitching fallen warriors back together. The tenacity of the orc army was incredible, yet it was the orcs' earthcast equivalent, the individuals known as mechs, that robbed the Tau of their greatest strength. Ghoul's Gorge, named for the cannibalistic atrocity that had taken place between the two rival Kroot kindreds of the time, was a vast open canyon that howled with fierce desert winds. Battle erupted when a vast horde of orcs sought to push through the gorge and fall upon the biodomes beyond. In their midst it was a giant, drill-armed walker designed to breach the transplastic shells of the domes, as much a pagan idol as a weapon of war. Farsight had no inclination to see if it would work. He drove his teams in close, harrying the orc column from above, whilst they were still bottlenecked in the gorge. As plasma fire rained down, shimmering domes flicked into existence above each mob, lit by the energies cascading across their bubble-like surfaces. Even the drill titan Stomper was protected by a fierce dome. The heavy rail rifle sounds of Farsight's broadside teams simply disintegrating on impact. The ensuing battle was torturous for Farsight's Tau. They could not abandon their charges in the biodomes, and yet their firepower was all but useless against the flashing bubble fields of the orcs. The impetuous young Commander Brightsword mounted a close-range battlesuit attack on the rearmost orc mob. He and his team quickly established that it was the only way to circumvent the bubble fields, to get inside them, placing the Tau just where the orcs wanted them to be, unfortunately. So began the massacre at Ghoul's Gorge, the most disastrous battle yet to have taken place during the entire Arkunasha War. Every time the Tau penetrated a bubble field in order to strike at the greenskins within, the orcs would charge headlong into their foes, guns blazing. Close combats erupted along the length of the gorge, as the cramped conditions the Tau had engineered for the battle prevented them from using hit-and-run tactics. Although Farsight himself used a daring vertical strike to immobilize the clanking, fat-bellied driller at the heart of the orc horde, he was forced to order his cadre to withdraw before their losses were untenable. The commander reluctantly retreated to his mobile headquarters to reconsider his strategy. In consultation with his ethereal advisors, Farsight once more respectfully requested reinforcement from Viola. The war hung in the balance, he claimed. A determined assault on key orc positions could see the course of the entire campaign end in favour of the Tau. There was a lengthy silence before the ethereals replied that a Tau ship from Viola was indeed abound. They would say no more on the matter. When a lone orca dropship descended upon Arkunasha, Farsight and his closest advisors met it in person atop a massive natural plateau in the Argap highlands. When the large ramp opened at the orca's fore, and the promised reinforcements stepped out, 2 ceremonial honor guards and a single ethereal were there. Farsight did well to choke down the surprise and frustration that rose in his chest. A single ethereal. Their presence was good for morale, to be sure, but they could hardly be counted in a concrete asset, and certainly not the auxiliary hunter cadre that Oshavar had been hoping for. He turned to his own ethereal advisors in dismay, but held his tongue. It was well that he did, for his actions were being monitored very closely indeed. The newcomer announced himself as Anshi of Viorla. He was a veteran of scores of battles, had many scars attesting to that fact, and he carried himself with the surety of a warrior lord. The ethereal calmly explained that over the next few years the Firecast were to withdraw entirely from Arkunasha, taking as many of the planet's colonists with them as they could. He would oversee the extraction personally. There would be no more attacks, no more killing blows, only defense. The plateau on which they stood would be their fortress, and they would protect it with every iota of their being until every living Tau had left the planet. This they would do for the greater good, effective immediately. Farsight nodded curtly at the news, and bowed low in obeisance. In a secret part of his soul, however, he felt a great disquiet stirring. Nevertheless, a senior ethereal had spoken. A simple commander could not hope to appreciate the full scale of the High Council's plans. Over the course of the next year, Farsight enacted the Ethereal Council plans to the letter, consolidating the civilian Tau into a series of hastily constructed biodomes atop the Agat Plateau. He defended the natural fortress with every weapon and strategy at his disposal. Though he lost thousands of good soldiers in the process, he further whittled down the numbers of the War that had by now converged upon his position. In the process, he continued to attack their command structure, prioritizing the deaths of mechs, medics, and warrior leaders until there were no more left amongst them. In their haste to make war, the orcs that had encircled the plateau relentlessly ground themselves to its defences until the valleys below were choked with corpses. Not one of them had the vision or perspective to retreat, and Farsight pitilessly exterminated those who broke through his cordons. Many of Commander Farsight's pupils, Brightsword the most strident among them, called for revenge for the fallen. They proposed a full push to exterminate the aliens once and for all, finally, before their extraction. Oshavar soberly argued against this course of action. So it was that the Tau colonists were evacuated from Arkunasha, and the Firecast among them. The Firecast returned to Arkunasha the next year, with the exhaustive cartographic information harnessed by Farsight's Warscaper drones, and with the Book of the Beast to guide them, they made short work of the orcs left there. The War had effectively been broken at Argat Plateau, reduced to less than 1/100th of the size it had been when it first reached the planet's red sands. The Tau's hunter cadre cleansed and reclaimed the planet in the space of less than a year, reinstalling the colonists dome by dome as the Earthcast brought the conurbations back to functional state. Soon the planet glittered like a jewel amongst the stars once more, but Commander Farsight was not there to witness it. His destiny lay elsewhere. The Tau had been assailed by a new foe, the Imperium of Man. The Tau's first encounters with the Imperium were based on subtle infiltration, though when the masters of humanity learned of their subversion, a storm of violence followed. The resultant war crossed the Damocles Gulf and broke upon the heartlands of the Tau Empire. Without the actions of Commander Farsight, the Sept Worlds might well have been wiped out, and with them the light of the unique civilization of the Tau. Situated coreward of the Tau Empire, the Damocles Gulf was a yawning stellar anomaly that had long spelled little more than confusion and death for the Tau. Unknown forces roiled within it, like oceanic currents that could not be predicted or even monitored by conventional science. However, the Earthcast's invention of the ZFR Horizon Accelerator engine allowed the Tau to circumvent the worst of the Gulf's malevolent attentions. Within years of the ZFR engine's invention, the Tau had successfully crossed the Damocles Gulf and begun to explore the cluster of worlds on the other side. Instead of conquering them with a costly series of wars, ethereal Unva masterminded a long and subtle campaign of integration. Although it took decades, the Tau inveigled themselves into the human civilizations that dwelt there, with trade, diplomacy, and above all patience as their weapons. They effectively converted the human worlds into extensions of the Tau Empire without firing a single shot. The interstellar behemoth that is the Imperium of Man is cumbersome indeed, but it is also mighty and vengeful beyond reason, not to mention jealous. Word eventually filtered back to the High Lords of Terra that the worlds they had controlled in the Timbra subsector on the eastern fringe were no longer paying tithes, and worse still, that their planetary governors were in thrall to a Xenos race. This they would not allow to go unpunished, and so the Imperium responded with slow but unstoppable force. The promising Damocles expansion ended in a series of harrowing wars that saw the Tau driven back from their newly acquired planets to the Sept Worlds of the First Sphere. Even worse, the Imperial fleets had not been content merely to let the Tau flee. The cathedral ships of the human military crossed the Damocles Gulf using some arcane science that defied description, opening portals in the fabric of space, and soon the warriors they carried were falling upon the heartlands of the alien civilization that dared encroach upon their pure and sovereign empire. The first planetary target that the Imperium had identified was Daleth Sept, a prosperous and highly cultured system with its origins in the First Sphere expansion. The defenses of the outlying colony worlds of Hydas, Sail-Kel, and Visel collapsed one after the other. The Imperium's ram-beaked starships blasted their way across Sept space, the battleships of the Space Marines at their fore. The sudden appearance of the Imperial fleet caught the Tau completely unprepared. Even though the Tau Navy scrambled what ships it could from Dalaith, Prayen, and Dalaya, the throng of floating colossi in their midst outweighed them massively. A strange battle commenced as each fleet's admirals took the measure of their foes and were left confounded. Against the sheer power of the largest Imperial battleships, even Manta missile destroyers, Custodian-class battleships, and Star-Tide-class interceptors were outclassed. In turn, the unparalleled mobility of the Tau craft allowed them to evade every Imperial gun, and boarding torpedo that pointed in their direction, until the Tau Armada could respond by force in scrambling battlecruiser fleets from Korvathra Navy docks on the system's edge. Dalith Sept was on its own. A period of unprecedented mayhem and confusion erupted as the Imperial fleet fought its way through the orbital defences of Prayen and barged straight into the Dalith Sept, intending to make planetfall upon the Tau homeworlds no matter the cost. Commander Farsight was briefed on the situation and told that his forces would join those of his old training rival O'Shasera in repelling the Imperium from Dalith. O'Shavar swore he would either cleanse the planet of human scum or die in magnificence. There would be no retreat this time, only victory or death. The aircast of Dalith knew their efforts would be pivotal in the war that was about to consume their planet. They meditated serenely as the Imperial fleet approached, but each pilot had a spark of anticipation in his heart. That spark was fanned into a flame by Commander Farsight's heroic speech at Zephyr Peak, an address that played to the aircast's pride, patriotism, and skill in equal measure. Under the direction of Farsight's trusted aircast ally, Admiral Kor-O Lee Maoteng, the pilots of the Sept worlds would counterattack in force. The Imperium descended upon Dalith with such murderous violence that the skies turned black with carbon within the first week of engagement. Grotesquely large dropships, painted in with the drab olive tones of the Imperial Guard, were the first to descend. They approached Dalith in a two-stage vector that saw them first act as aircraft carriers, then, after landing, as mechanized transports that deployed troops and tanks alike on a massive scale. The skies above Dalith's hexadomes were soon buzzing and roaring with the engines of crude Imperial fighters and transports. War scarred the skies long before a single shot was fired on the purple-grassed plains below. With the Imperial forces committed, squadron after squadron of barracudas, razor sharks, tiger sharks, and sun shark bombers lifted out of the uppermost panels of hexadomes across the planet, linking their sensor suites into a lattice of supporting data. They met up in mid-air to form staggered picket lines, each supported by clouds of networked drones that buzzed in their wake like obedient insects. Any enemy aircraft that was caught by their net would be shot down in short order. The aircast's sky-trawling tactics proved to be extremely effective against the crude craft of the Imperial Guard, but they were found wanting when the crenellated strike cruisers above sent their own squadrons to fight. Huge warrior craft, emblazoned in bright heraldic colours, triggered their afterburners to hurtle in an almost vertical approach, stub-winged escort craft to either side. Monitor drone scans picked out the icons emblazoned on the flanks of each vehicle. These were Space Marine craft, their blunt hulls somehow reminiscent of flying fists and launched with much the same intent. The Space Marine gunship squadrons roared towards the aircast trawler net with terrific speed, guns blasting as they came. Inevitably, the heavily armoured steersmen of each craft seemed to be seeking out the mid-air collisions, roaring at a tight downward angle straight into the ordered matrix of each Tau fighter craft. The aircast pilots were forced to break formation, wheeling away in curling evasive maneuvers. Farsight had to admit that he was impressed. The directness and bravery of such a deployment vector was commendable. He decided to take his own insurgency force of crisis teams to the site of this new attack. With his battlesuit teams leaping out from graceful Manta missile destroyers, and his ground forces transported en masse by the planet's magna-rail networks, O'Shavar was able to react to the vertical incursions of the Space Marines with impressive speed. Targeting data acquired on the far side of the Damocles Gulf had shown the Imperial shock troops to be extremely heavily armoured, and so Farsight had taken the precaution of having every XV-8 crisis battlesuit under his command equipped with dual plasma rifles. It proved to be the right decision. The mass-reactive shells, fired by the Space Marine squads deploying from each insertion pod, were fierce indeed, but few penetrated the armoured shells of the battlesuits that arced down from the skies. Under Farsight's strict instruction, whichever one crisis battlesuit was hit would peel back to be replaced by a fully operational replacement. Wave by wave the crisis teams descended, their numbers such that from a distance they seemed like a Viorlan seed storm floating to Earth. Hundreds of plasma rifles spat bursts of burning fire down into the ranks of the Space Marines, melting through ceramite and searing through flesh to scorch the ground beneath. The sizzling holes in their torsos exposing innards to the air. Incredibly, many of the fallen Space Marines still fought on, firing powerful sidearms from the ground and shouting their defiance, even as their vital fluids drained away. It was an amazing display of fortitude and determination in the face of devastating firepower, and it impressed Farsight deeply, as did the courage of the white-armoured medics administering to their fallen brothers. Yet courage would not be enough to save them. By the time the Fire Warrior support cadre had arrived, all that remained of the Space Marine insertion within Gelbrin was smoking ruin. As all-out war unfolded in the skies above, the monstrous tracked transports of the Imperial Guard and the giant walkers that stomped in their vanguard simply ignored the best efforts of the air caste. Their crackling shields and thick hides were all but impenetrable to anything short of railgun fire, and they knew it. The vast metal transports settled in great wallowing clouds of steam before unfurling their ramps like broad, flat tongues, disgorging regiment after regiment of soldiers from their gullets. Strike forces of Tau moved to intercept, but whenever they hove into view, the immense Imperial Titans that flanked each deployment ramp would unleash firepower so intense that the Hunter cadre were forced to take evasive action of their own. The massive machines were demigods of battle. Each was an avatar to destruction given form on a scale undreamt of, even by the most ambitious of the Earth-caste's battlesuit designers. Here was mankind's warlike deity made manifest, just as the effigy walkers of the primitive orcs represented their own belligerent gods. Under the protection of these god machines, the endless ranks of Imperial soldiery marched. Elsewhere, thousands of ponderous Imperial tanks churned the planet's indigo grass into thick mud as they rumbled into attack formations. Farsight's Hunter cadre were ready to engage, but even the most veteran Fireblade was forced to admit that the sheer scale of the task was bewildering. In the space of a single day, the Imperium had bulldozed a series of beachheads into Dalaith with little more than faith and brute force. Despite sustaining heavy losses to long-range suppression fire, they were slowly converging on the capital hexadomes central to the planet's eastern hab states. As night began to fall on the first day of the invasion, Commander Farsight called an emergency conclave of the commanders not yet involved in the battle. The Space Marines that had dared to assault the city of Gelbrinn had been neutralized, but the vast bulk of Imperial armies were yet to engage. Their advance had been stalled by staggered missile strikes from the hills around Gelbrinn, and their outriders had been slain by optimized stealth teams, but the solid core remained. The battle for Dalaith had only just begun. As Commander Farsight was bringing his emergency conclave to a consensus of all-out attack, an athletic Tau female swept into the room. Her self-possession and cold beauty demanded attention as she strode to the command bridge with her head held high. She moved in front of Farsight, blocking him from view as she calmly outlined her plan. The Firecast Reserve would join her hunter cadre in a series of stealth attacks using the darkness and drawing the enemy to overextend themselves in pursuit. Only then would the true counterattacks be launched. She issued specific orders to those commanders not belonging to Farsight's contingent, and one by one they bowed their heads. When Commander Shadowsun strode back out, without a word to Farsight, a full half of the emergency conclave went with her. Farsight's grip on his sword tightened, but he held his peace. He recalled the words of Master Puretide, reminding himself that although he and his fellow commander were very different, they strove for the same goals. Scant hours later, there came reports of a series of devastating attacks that had been made under cover of darkness. The tactics employed were Oshazera's, no doubt. Commander Farsight could recognize them anywhere. The Imperium's immense phalanxes were flailing blindly, lashing out in all directions, as their outlying vehicles were destroyed one after another by point-blank fusion fire. As soon as their primitive vision sensors had been opened wide to scry the Dalathian night, Oshazera had released bursts of multispectral light that blinded her prey even more effectively than the pitch darkness of the plains. Confusion reigned around the perimeter of each Imperial column, as carefully placed tank killers hemmed in the great mass of each vehicle company. Spearheads of trundling battle tanks and super-heavy ordnance split off from the main mass whenever they could, blasting a path through the magneral tunnels that blocked them in order to pursue the signal ghosts of this new threat, in which they failed. The war that unfolded over the next few months saw the differing styles of Puretide students writ large. Their strategies were painted in blood upon the canvas of Dalaith's battlefields. Wherever Oshazera's infiltration and misdirection tactics blinded the military behemoth of the Imperial Guard, Space Marine strike forces raced to intercept, their rugged technology and genetically engineered strength outmatching the stealth teams and forcing them to withdraw. As soon as the Space Marines committed themselves, Oshavar and his battlesuit spearheads would fall upon them from above, crippling their transports with XV-88 broadside battlesuit fire, and meeting the stranded survivors in a series of deadly close-quarter battles. In the sky war above, Kor O-Li Mao Teng's aircast pilots took a heavy toll. Even the Admiral himself joined the fight in his personalized Barracuda, hunting Space Marine gunships like a great golden raptor harrying a pack of corvids. A young progeny of the original Commander Brightsword excelled himself in a series of close-quarter battlesuit actions in the Battle of Var Isar Gate, even managing to stamp a skull-masked warrior leader into a broken mass of ceramite and pulped flesh in one assault. Farsight commissioned his ingenious Earthcast ally, Ovessa, to devise new weapons capable of dealing with the thickly armoured tanks of the Imperium's armies, and the scientists' teams worked night and day, distributing them via the messenger warriors of the air caste. However, the Space Marines struck back hard, eventually assailing Gelbrin City with an insertion pod assault so ferocious that it shattered the hexadome roof and blew out the atmosphere inside. Even Farsight had to pull back when the Imperials teleported their own war-suited warriors into the central plaza. Tau blood flowed through the streets as armoured companies ringed the city, cutting off any escape from the Space Marines ravaging through the outer districts. It was a story repeated in 5 more cities before the war was over, for a company of Space Marines was committed to each conquest, every one a force that even the finest of Farsight's Firecast cadres was hard-pressed to match. The bitter war on Dalaith was characterized not by martial prowess alone, but by a hectic race for information. The 2 stellar empires fought not only to defeat their foes, but to understand their weaknesses. The Imperium changed its tactics after the Battle of Via Meshla, where outgunned Imperial Guard regiments successfully charged a Tau gun line, and despite sustaining heavy casualties, won a bloody victory purely with bayonets and boots. Since that day, the Imperial invaders drove in to engage the Tau at close quarters whenever they could. For his part, Cheval studied the Imperium forces relentlessly. He endlessly adapted strategies, counter-strategies, and target priorities, distributing drone-borne guider programs to all of his commanders. The Imperium took its own tactical manual, the Codex Astartes, and applied its principles to whatever the Tau threw at them. The Hammers of Dawn chapter were especially efficient at codifying Tau threats and responding in force, for they lived every word of the Codex and never deviated from its teachings, no matter the cost. Farsight took a great interest in the patterns that emerged during the Imperial war effort, making extensive notes and even refining prototype simulations as the war unfolded. He noted that the Imperial armies appeared to value armor above all else, so he pioneered the early Sunforge pattern of battlesuit armament as a counter. This allowed crisis teams to drop down from manta destroyers into their vehicular prey, crippling them at once with close-range blasts from their dual fusion blasters, and then boosting off into the skies once more to be picked up by the mantas on the return run. Meanwhile, Oshasera took her stealth cadre to the dark side of Daleth, constantly moving in rotation with the system's sun, so that every raid she performed was under cover of darkness. Farsight monitored her progress not through open communication, but by the trail of smoking wrecks she left in her wake. Despite their best efforts, the forces of Farsight and Oshasera had, at their command, could not be everywhere at once. The Imperium was a powerful foe indeed, and unlike the barbarous orc race, it appeared to have a strategy worked out for every combat environment and tactic that the Tau could engineer. The defiance of the Fire Caste's spirited defense, the Imperium had gradually but irresistibly worn against and overtaken several of the planet's cities, slaughtering any Tau within and fortifying the war-torn structures to be used against the Tau. The Ethereals, in overall command of the war effort, could not countenance such losses. After more extreme measures were taken to stall the Imperial advance, whilst reinforcements were brought in from other worlds in the Sept and beyond. Yet on the field of battle, far more drastic measures were being taken. To Farsight's quiet horror, Experimental neurochip prototypes, containing the recorded strategies of Commander Puretide, were surgically installed in the minds of cadre fireblades and battlesuit Tau commanders, allowing them to function as military leaders that thought alike and could adapt to any situation. That was the theory, at least, though the so-called Swords of Puretide enjoyed great success against the rank and file. When the forces of the Imperium brought strange, gaunt psychers, who reduced battlesuits to ruin with gestures of their wizened hands, the implanted leaders had none of their own previous learnings to draw upon, and faltered badly. The confusion cost hundreds of lives, as the minds of their leaders struggled to respond to this new threat, locked into a previous understanding of tactics, which was nevertheless exceptional, but had not encountered psychers before. As the war effort continued to unravel, Kroot mercenaries were dispatched by the thousand through the Magnorail networks, rushed to wherever the Imperium forced a breach in the network of tunnels crisscrossing Dalaith, and spilling out like blood from an opened artery to fall upon the Imperial troops nearby. Zipping through the sky above them would come 100-strong networks of gun drones, their pulse carbine fire taking a butcher's toll as they hovered out of reach of shell and blade. In this way the Imperial forces were pinned in place long enough for Farsight or Oshacera's cadre to scramble to the breach and avenge the Kroot that had given their lives in the Empire's defence. Farsight took this tactic one step further at the siege of Ralatas, a dome city famous for its sculptures of living light. With the Tau's most capable commanders engaged on the other side of the planet, an Imperial dropship landed only a few miles from the city gates. Within hours, Ralatas was surrounded by Imperial tanks, including several super-heavy squadrons powerful enough to blast breaches in the city walls. With the exception of the Kroot kindreds that made their homes in the dome's sprawling arboreal districts, the city had only a small garrison of fire warriors to defend it. Certainly nothing that could deal with over 1,000 battle tanks. Shasgra, a cadre fireblade in charge of the garrison, patched through an urgent message to Farsight, requesting help. Oshovra could give him none, but said he would think on it. Less than a minute later a reply reached Shasgra, and he spread the word to the Earthcast artisans aboard the city. Just as the Imperials breached the walls and began to barge their way into Ralatas' perimeter, the city went completely dark. Suddenly, a massive electromagnetic pulse boomed outwards, as every one of the city's light sculptures, fusion arrays, and co-generators hurled their potential energy in a devastating wave. The EMP tidal wave scrambled the cogitators of every Imperial tank and walker within a mile of the city walls, stopping them in their tracks. It was then that massed Kroot carnivore squads poured out of every breach, bounding and leaping towards the foe. Kroot hounds ran down those who tried to flee, whilst Kroot oxen ripped open the hatches and doors of the silenced tanks, allowing their ferocious kin to climb inside. The grisly feast that followed has never been broadcast on open Tau channels, although it was said that Oshavar watched it several times. Though the Imperium had taken a great toll, and half of Dalaith had been abandoned or reduced to smoking rubble, their attacks were slowly losing momentum. The Tau used everything they had learnt in the war thus far to great effect, using the EMP tactics that saved Ralatas to divide the Imperial armies into disparate chunks and then take them apart piece by piece. In the process, they had bought enough time for the other Sept worlds to contribute reinforcements. A steady stream of fire-cast cadres made planetfall with every new day, and the Imperial Navy was forced to retreat in the face of overwhelming numbers. As for the Space Marines, their dogmatic adherence to the certain set-piece strategies and tactics eventually became their undoing. In conjunction with Oshacera, Commander Farsight masterminded several large-scale assaults that saw his fellow commander draw the Space Marines into the open, only for Oshavar to fall upon them with all the speed and fury that he had become famous for now. As the weeks ground on, the masters of the Imperial Crusade were forced to admit that they had spread their forces too thin. Now that their supply lines had been established, the Tau had almost a limitless supply of war materiel, and astropathic messages transmitted across the Damocles Gulf spoke of a new alien threat assailing the Imperium. Regiment by regiment, company by company, the Imperial presence upon Dalaith began to withdraw. Farsight and his acolytes were already preparing to encircle and destroy the retreating Imperial armies when a contingent of water-caste diplomats made an official visit. A trio of ethereals delivered the message that the Imperial troops were to be allowed to flee unhindered. A communique had been received from one Captain Sevelank of the Hammers of Dawn, accepting the truce the water-caste had offered on the Tau Empire's behalf. Though the Tau's confidence in their own supremacy had been severely shaken, they had triumphed in the final reckoning and learned much about the Imperium. Not only did the Imperium withdraw its forces from Dalaith Sept, but from Tau space altogether, retreating across the Damocles Gulf in as strange a manner as they had come. They left behind a swathe of broken and abandoned technology. Every last piece of what was discovered by the Earthcast was studied in painstaking detail, of course. The vast majority of Imperial war tech was declared inferior and of no use to the greater good. The Ovesa made some astonishing discoveries in the depths of his labs about the esoteric technologies used by the humans' fleets. As for the commanders dubbed the Swords of Puretide, all of the engrams that had been surgically inserted in Dalaith's warrior leaders were forcibly removed. The invasive procedures left those who had been operated upon as drooling and pliant simpletons, a sad loss to the Empire. Yet, as the watercast patiently explained, such was the sometimes painful cost of victory. When Ornvar and his honor guard came to collect Farsight's old teammate, Commander Shah Vastos, for his scheduled engram removal, the veteran warrior was absent from his quarters. When questioned about his appearance, Oshavar mournfully confirmed that Shavastos had in fact fallen in the last engagement of the war, and his body had been burnt to an unrecognizable crisp. Such was the cost of victory, explained Oshavar, dipping his head in sorrow. Unvar met Farsight's gaze for a long time, before turning on his heel and heading back the way he came, his ceremonial escort trailing in his wake. The Tau Empire had faced off against an insanely strong opponent and emerged victorious, but the cost of that victory had been very high indeed. Every one of the worlds settled on the other side of the Damocles Gulf had been left to the Imperium in the early stages of its crusade, and one of the prime sept worlds of the Empire had been badly mauled. The notion of the Tau's natural supremacy in the universe had been shaken to its core. In this time of doubt, Ethereal Master Unvar negotiated with Ethereal Supreme Unwei, and a plan of reconquest, led by Oshavar, was initiated. Unvar's decision for Farsight to lead the reconquest was not taken lightly, but when the matter was settled, it had the full power of the Master behind it. The first few weeks saw Oshavar elevated from the status of hero of the Arkunasha War and the Damocles Gulf Crusade to that of vaunted survivor. With the persuasive acts of the watercast as his tools, Unvar began a propaganda campaign that saw Oshavar's military successes become often told legends. Statues to Farsight's greatness were erected in every major battle dome, pod complex, and naval harbour across the worlds of the First Sphere. Fire warriors of every rank had images or hollow cuts of Farsight somewhere in their possession, sometimes even displayed alongside those of Unwei and Unvar themselves. For Oshavar the attentions were bewildering and unwelcome. The commander was greeted with the hunter's salute so many times each day that he feared he would wear out his arm joints before the crusade even started. Yet he bore it all stoically, understanding that the Empire needed its heroes on a metaphysical level that was bigger than his own whims. On accounts of the ethereals, there were concerns that Oshavar would not live up to the propaganda. The Damocles Gulf would not fall twice to the wiles of Tau diplomats. This time the Firecast would have to lead the charge on every world. If Dalith was any indication of the Imperium's threat, blood would be spilt in great measure, and these worlds had little access to reinforcements. The final result of all the effort saw the mobilization of the greatest fleet the Tau Empire had ever seen. The sheer number of Tau battleships, navy vessels, escorts, colony ships, warp spheres, gravpulse tugs, dropships, and outrider patrols assembled for the coalition defied belief. Once the preparations were complete, Unwei gave one of his final speeches, and a fleet of the Great Reclamation was launched into the Damocles Gulf amongst grand celebration. Something in Farsight's gut felt strange, but he was the model of a noble commander nonetheless. If the Empire needed a conqueror he would be. During the hours of the journey across the Gulf, when he was not in stasis, Farsight gathered every action report and drone capture snippet that he could lay his hands on for the war for Dalith. With the help of Commander Brightsword and his old ally Ovasa, Oshavar gradually built up a comprehensive picture of Imperial war doctrine. Day and night he pored over how the armies of humanity acted in different scenarios, situations, and theatres of war, how they made planetfall, what it took to provide them and provoke them, and what it took to break them. There were elements of the Imperium's armies, notably the Hammers of Dawn, whose adherence to a set methodology was almost fanatical. Such was the diligence and precision with which they observed their military doctrine that, in studying them, Commander Farsight was able to write down their tactical imperatives as a set of commandments. By the time this coalition had crossed the Damocles Gulf, Oshavar had pieced together much of what he and his lieutenants referred to as the human war schematic, a code that he believed the Imperium's troops observed at all times. In doing so, he learned a good deal about the blind spots in the Tau's traditional military doctrine, and began to adjust his repertoire of strategies to compensate for these oversights. As the Tau arrived once more on the far side of the Gulf, Farsight used his newfound knowledge about the Imperium to dramatic effect. With the bulk of the Imperial military in the sector pulled away to engage Hive Fleet Behemoth, Commander Oshavar found himself waging a series of campaigns in which he held the advantage from the start. The planetary defense forces left to garrison the worlds of the Timbra sector, though over 100 million strong on planets such as Vespertine and Matinsong, were lured into a series of mock wars by vanguard Tau forces. Time after time, modest raids would lure out defenders, hoping to secure a front only they considered relevant. Once they had committed themselves, the remainder of Farsight's force would fall in from the skies and deliver a killing blow of such efficacy it would have impressed Puretide himself. Over and over again, Oshavar's foresight paid off, and the Tau Empire rejoiced with every new conquest. Through a combination of military acumen, hard work, and verve, Commander Farsight had lived up to the inflated claims of the Ethereals that they made in his name as a propaganda effort. World by world, battle by battle, the Damocles Gulf was brought back into the fold. The reconquests of the 4 principal worlds on the distant side of the Gulf were bloody in the extreme. Farsight's incredible ability to second-guess his foes made for a string of impressive victories, but as the anarchy of battle rolled out across the sector, the Imperium dealt the Farsight Expedition, as it came to be known, a great many wounds of its own. By the time the fleet had reached the last system of previously colonized regions, there were fewer than half of the original ships of the expedition remaining. Oshavar felt every loss keenly, not merely as a military setback, but as an emotional and spiritual wound. His ethereal advisors had made it plain that there would be no more reinforcements, not this far from the Empire. The Tau were not the only ones to have taken advantage of the Imperium's armies being withdrawn, however. By the time the coalition arrived, the asteroid belt to the east of the enclaves was infested with orcs. The Tau fleet mounted a series of swift raids to repel the orc raiders from their recaptured territory, each one successful and efficient. However, as space-capable drones made their flyby scans, the horrible truth became clear. Almost every asteroid large enough to hold them was teeming with orcs, and if the fleet's readings were correct, the asteroid belt was but the tip of an empire that stretched all the way into the next star system. The Farsight expedition was on the brink of total victory, but the orc presence disturbed Oshavar greatly. He meditated upon this new information for many hours, and upon returning to his ship's command bridge, he gave an order that would shake the Tau Empire to its core. He announced that the destruction of the orcs was a higher priority than concluding the reconquest. He would expend every effort to exterminate them, targeting every planet they had infected, in this system and the next. It was the first time a Tau of any rank had disobeyed a direct order from the Ethereal Council. Oshavar's decision was an unbreakable breach of the chain of command. For the newly claimed Farsight enclaves, it was only the beginning.
To you I will give the gilded sword that jingles from rings of gold, and strike with it in battle as you will, in the battle